Italy, particularly because one of the planes going into action tonight will be the so-called Prowler, which is an electronic surveillance aircraft. It takes out radars. Now, that was the plane that was flying low and cut the wires on a gondola and killed 20 people here in Italy. So clearly the Prime Minister here is reacting with sensitivity to those fears.
David Chater for now. Thanks very much indeed. Our Middle East correspondent David Chater telling us that 4 stealth fighter bombers have left the Aviano air.
One of the journalists who was on board the B-52 mission yesterday, the first wave to strike at Serbia. Steve Komarow, thanks for joining us. Can you relive for us briefly your impressions of what must have been an extraordinary day in your life?
Well, it was fascinating. These old B-52 bombers, which are almost as old as I am, and I won't reveal how old that is, has still had to fly a 10-hour mission. They did it with very few problems, and it was a study in contrast. You have about the oldest airplanes around and launching these very sophisticated and very sleek cruise missiles.
How much of the mission were you allowed to reveal? Were you under very strict instructions of what you could and couldn't report?
Well, it was fairly standard instructions, really. I was allowed to report anything about the mission so long as it didn't give away future missions. You know, I can't say, for example, how many targets they may want to hit in the future, that sort of thing. And you know, just being in the middle of it all, you get exposed to a fair amount of that sort of information.
Were you aware specifically of the moment they released those missiles?
Oh, absolutely. There was quite a build-up to it. It took quite a long time to get to the launch box, as they call it, and all along the way they are doing the missiles would wake up. I couldn't tell you how that all works, but it seemed to work. And then I was listening on the headphones as they made the countdown for each launch. And for each launch, the bomb bays would open, and when the missile dropped, the plane would shudder, and you can imagine what that's like on a plane as big as a B-52, quite an event.
Steve Komarow from USA Today, many thanks for joining us from RAF Fairford.
It's around Pristina. Then 6 RAF Harriers followed up the attack, but they couldn't get a clear sight of their target. One bomb was dropped before the mission was aborted and they returned to base. Well, there's extensive coverage and reaction here on Sky News, of course.
Right on the horizon here, towards the centre of the city. There have been protests here. Another big explosion there. It's not quite rocking the ground, but I can tell you these are definitely very big explosions in Skopje, the capital of Macedonia. There are police going up and down the street with sirens blowing. There is a helicopter, at least one helicopter, possibly 2, flying above me now. They've been circling for the past half an hour. Just about an hour ago, there was a big demonstration in the centre of the Macedonian capital, Skopje, in the hotel where all the foreign journalists and the international aid workers who've recently been evacuated from Kosovo are staying. There's a great anti-Western sentiment, or not Western, but anti-Allied sentiment here. The crowd of about 2,000 surged forward, throwing stones at the vehicles, wrecking camera equipment, and everybody had to seek retreat into the hotel. Let me tell you, there are more what appear to be large explosions coming from the horizon in the middle of Skopje. There are helicopters flying above, there are flashing lights, horns are blowing. I can tell you that there's a very dramatic situation here. We don't quite know what exactly it is going on. What we do know is that over the last hour there have been big protests in the middle of Skopje. Another big explosion there, and there was a protest outside the American embassy with thousands of people outside burning American flags. There was a car on fire outside of the back gate of the American embassy. We've had no confirmation that the American embassy itself has been set on flames. We have no reports to that effect. It's very difficult to go and see for ourselves. The whole area has been cordoned off by riot police dressed in bulletproof armour. We're not allowed to go down there. Cars are being turned back. We're having to stay, the security forces tell us, in the compound of our hotel. Back to you.
Matthew, how many NATO forces have been in that area up until this started just a few moments ago?
Well, I can tell you there's been about, over the last couple of months, there's been a build-up of NATO forces in Macedonia, about 10,000 troops here from NATO countries, from countries like France, from Britain, from Germany, from Holland. There are no American troops here right now with NATO. They're here in anticipation, of course, of a NATO order to move into Kosovo if there is any kind of peace deal signed there. NATO has been very clear on this point. This is not an aggressive force. Despite the NATO air attacks on neighbouring Yugoslavia, just a few kilometres from here, NATO has been very clear that the NATO force in Macedonia is a peaceful one. It's not an aggressive one. It's there to go in as a peacekeeping force, and if there is no peace deal, NATO has said very clearly these troops won't go in. But having said that, let me tell you, there is a growing anti-NATO sentiment here in Macedonia. People here understand that the NATO troops, to some extent, were here as a peacekeeping force ready to go into Kosovo, but with the wave of airstrikes we saw last night, and with looming airstrikes again this evening, I can tell you there is a very great sense of unease here in Macedonia tonight.
Matthew Chance talking with us by telephone. Again, Matthew reporting that just seconds ago, a series of explosions he heard in on the horizon and saw. He doesn't know where they came from or their targets, but there has been some unrest building there.
Stars and Stripes flag being burned. Have you heard from your country? I mean, this is presumably a sense of outrage that's shared throughout the country, is it?
Of course, people cannot believe that the countries that we have been allies with for at least last 80 years, we fought together joint enemies during the First World War, during the Second World War. We have been a strategic ally of the West throughout the Cold War, and now all of a sudden we have become some kind of second-grade country and the citizens.
But
We've had reports and film of aircraft leaving bases forming up basically for the last hour and a half. If you then assume that from Aviano, say down to Kosovo, is about an hour and a half, 2 hours flight to Belgrade, perhaps an hour. Well, yesterday the strikes went in at about 7:10. London time, it's now 7:07. Air raid sirens going off in Belgrade. We're in the same time frame. But again, you were thinking about a coordinated attack with both cruise missiles from the sea, and let's remember the B-52s, which did cruise missile attacks yesterday, have not left RAF Fairford as far as we know to date, but cruise missiles from ships and perhaps submarines to back up and complement. We know the F-117s have taken off from Italy. We know F-16s. These are the stealth fighters. So you're seeing a formidable force package. We've had reports of the AWACS aircraft taking off. They will be used to coordinate the air picture, and if we bear in mind the reports of air-to-air combat between Yugoslav MiG-29s and American F-15s, that would have been controlled by the AWACS Sentry aircraft. Again, just on pictures there, we were seeing some of the electronic warfare aircraft, so vital if you're going to heavily defended areas. Again, large mixed force package, all the signs are there.
It might be reasonable to assume, in view of the British briefing today, that that there would be strikes at some of those targets, repeat strikes around Pristina, those ammunition dumps, because, of course, the Harriers didn't make it, really.
The Harriers had one of those problems of war. Because of some earlier air activity over their targets, there was so much smoke. Laser guidance of the first Harriers bombs was lost. Luckily, the bombs went into, we are told, just a field, and the other aircraft aborted the mission and returned with their ordnance. One got the impression from both Secretary of State for Defence George Robertson and from the Chief of Defence Staff, General Charles Guthrie, they were going to go back, and that you get the impression, because of the Harriers' specific roles and missions, it will probably stick around Kosovo. Whereas from Aviano down to Kosovo is a 2-hour flight, 2.5-hour flight. From the British base in the southern part of Italy into Kosovo is probably only 40 minutes. We're seeing there twin engine, that's twin-tail, twin-engine F-15. Most of those seem to be being used for air defence at the moment. Though we've seen some equipped for air-to-ground missions.
So when you say air defence, you mean they would go in a...
So just to limit the collateral damage and to destroy the targets that they were meant to destroy.
There's no sign of the planes moving here tonight, but if they're needed, they can get to the so-called launching box within cruise missile range of Serbia in just a few hours. Andrew Moore, Sky News at RAF Fairford.
On the Clyde families of the 116 men on board face an anxious wait. Splendid is the first Royal Navy nuclear-powered submarine to carry land attack missiles, and she played a crucial role in the initial strike against the Serbs. There's a feeling of pride amongst the wives here, but also
American fighter bomber aircraft around at the moment. We have seen them taking off from Aviano today. A couple of them looked as if they were on missions to protect one of the AWACS aircraft, which is going to control the whole air battle. Others, I suspect, will be going on bombing missions. And the F-15 Eagle, the EF model, the most modern of them, they were used, not very successfully one has to say, for scud hunting missions during the Gulf.
Into Yugoslavia face a serious threat, the Serbian surface-to-air missile system.
This does remain a risky operation. The air defense system is a strong system. It's redundant. The air defenders are well trained, and it is quite a heavy system in a small place.
It includes 60 sites with Soviet-era SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 surface-to-air missiles, some of which can reach altitudes of more than 30 miles. The Serbs also have hundreds of anti-aircraft rapid-fire guns and even shoulder-fired missiles, a particular threat to low-flying aircraft. Almost all of Yugoslavia's military hardware comes from Russia and is about 20 to 30 years old. But military experts still do not think Yugoslavia is an easy mark.
The stuff is old, but the question is how well maintained is it, and how well trained are they on the equipment?
The answer is very well trained and highly motivated, which could provide a challenge even against NATO's state-of-the-art weaponry. 400 total planes for NATO, which include American F-15s, 16s, and 18s, 7 B-52 bombers, 12 F-117 stealth fighters, and 2 B-2 bombers that made their combat debut.
The airplane performed magnificently. By all indications that we can get, the bombs went exactly where they wanted, and we did our job.
NATO is counting on another plane in its arsenal to combat Yugoslavia's surface-to-air missiles, the EA-6B Prowler.
The edge for us against their missiles is that we have these tactical electronic jamming aircraft. They go right along with the fighter group. They put out tremendous amounts of power and blank out the screens of the missile guidance systems and also deceive them.
All of this backed up by 3 destroyers, 1 cruiser, 2 submarines, and 3 amphibious-ready ships.
This massive show of force is tied together by a common mission, reiterated by President Clinton, to limit Serbia's ability to make war. Kelly Arena, CNN.
Over Belgrade confirmed what everyone here knew, that the bombing wasn't over. For 2 nights running now, the sky around Belgrade has been lit with the flashes of explosions from incoming NATO bombs and missiles. The targeting appears to be surgical. Damaged and destroyed military and industrial installations have been shown repeatedly on Serbian TV. Very little ordnance appears to have fallen into residential areas, although the Serbs have shown what appeared to be a civilian house that had been damaged. The Yugoslav authorities are claiming that there have been 10 civilian deaths. Other estimates are higher, but none of the numbers can be independently confirmed. Civilian casualties may have been kept low by the precision of the NATO targeting and by the fact that many civilians have been taking cover in shelters. Yugoslav resistance to the bombing has been slight. Only the occasional spray of anti-aircraft fire has been seen. The Serbs apparently not wanting to fire up their anti-aircraft missile sites at this stage for fear of having them taken out. And the targeting, at least on structures, is having some evident success. It doesn't, though, seem to be damaging Serb morale or resistance from the government or from the people. In their frustration at not being able to hit back at their attackers, the Serbs have lashed out at the nearest vulnerable target, Western journalists. I'm speaking to you tonight from Zagreb in Croatia because all Western journalists have now been ordered out of Yugoslavia. In fact, I had the dubious distinction of receiving a rap on my hotel door at 3:30 this morning, followed by 10 hours of isolation and inquisition on behalf of Serb security authorities before being driven to the border and dumped on the Croatian frontier. Dan?
Mark, tell me more about what happened to you.
As I said, about 3:30 this morning, a rap at the door, someone identifying themselves as room service, which I hadn't ordered, turned out to be 2 leather-jacketed, clad, pistol-carrying members of the Serb secret police. They took me and 1 other reporter from the Washington Post down to police headquarters. They isolated us for the next 10 hours.
quizzing us individually, trying to find out who our contacts were, trying to find out who we were working with. A severe, not physical, but a severe bit of at least psychological intimidation.
What was the worst of those 10 hours?
The worst of it was in the course of the most severe interrogation that I received. The air raid sirens went off in Belgrade again. The temperature had been rising psychologically in the inquiry room that I was in, facing a panel of 3 secret security officers. At that point, you could see the anger rise on their faces. They pointed out the window and said, "See what you're doing to us." They called it an aggression against civilization, as if somehow we as journalists were the instrument of American foreign policy. We did our best to explain that we were just trying to report what was going on.
Mark Phillips, thanks. Take care of yourself. The U.S. Air Force is carrying out most of the air attacks, but once again tonight, the first wave of missiles came from a fleet of U.S. Navy warships in the Adriatic Sea. CBS News correspondent Richard Roth is aboard the USS Philippine Sea on the firing line in the Adriatic.
From battle stations in the Adriatic, the U.S. Navy once again was lighting up the night, unleashing a volley of 17 cruise missiles from the USS Gonzales, firing 3 more from the USS Philippine Sea a few miles away. 2 cruise missiles clearly didn't make it, shipboard observers watching them fall seconds after launch. For the sailors on these ships, this high-tech naval warfare is long-distance combat. It's impersonal, said a sailor here. The adrenaline's not pumping, but your mind's working full speed. Thinking about what? Thinking, he said, about the people on the receiving end. Richard Roth, CBS News, aboard the USS Philippine Sea.
The biggest part of the air campaign so far consists of bombers flying out of the U.S. Air Base at Aviano, Italy, across the Adriatic Sea from the Balkans. CBS News senior European correspondent Tom Fenton is there. Tom?
Dan, well, NATO officials are saying this is going to be another night of maximum effort, and judging from what we've seen so far here this evening, that certainly seems to be the case.
Again tonight, a high-tech AWACS plane led the deadly procession into battle. Its mission, to track any threat to Allied aircraft. And after the brains, the brawn. Sleek stealth fighters and F-15s in a big hurry to be where the action is. After a busy night, ground crews today calmly went about their business of getting the aircraft ready to go out and do it again. Serbian Defiance is doing little to dampen enthusiasm for the task at hand.
It's a good rush. It's a nice rush. Great feeling.
Due to security concerns, the pilots are off limits. But among crew members allowed to speak with the press, everyone was very on message about the mission and the Kosovars.
If I can bring someone some joy in their life and some relief, then I'm here to do it as long as I can, 24 hours a day if I have to.
NATO might have to take that airman up on his offer. The way things are going, it may have to continue this operation for some time, Dan.
Tom Fenton in Aviano, Italy. One of the few Western reporters still on the ground in Kosovo and communicating is Leanne Martindale of CBS News Radio and Television. I talked to her late today by telephone from her hiding place in Kosovo.
Now, in the last few hours since the NATO attacks have begun, I've heard about 4 or 5 explosions. The last one shook the apartment where I am. The people here are just I think, in a real state of fear. You can hear some AK-47 fire in the air after this last explosion, and the streets are just completely dead.
Leanne Martindale reporting from Kosovo. Journalists from NATO countries were expelled from Kosovo today. Among them was CBS News veteran war correspondent Alan Pizzi, who witnessed the start of the air war from the Kosovo capital of Pristina.
A distant boom and a huge flash on the horizon were the first indications that the attack had begun in Kosovo last night. It was 3 minutes before 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. local. The explosions were well spaced out at the beginning. Then, after a long and eerily quiet pause, a sustained assault on a target to the southwest of Pristina. All power was cut within minutes of the attack. The city plunged into blackness. The hits were miles from the city center, but a military airstrip and bases are known to be in that direction. In the city, sporadic gunfire was heard. A huge ball of fire fell from the sky, drawing rounds of anti-aircraft fire. Sirens wailed and police and army vehicles raced through the deserted streets. The official Serb Information Center reported that Kosovo Liberation Army guerrillas took advantage of the airstrikes to launch attacks on police and army positions. There were also reports of urban areas being hit and of civilian casualties.
Confirming any of the claims or figuring out exactly what the cruise missile struck is impossible. Journalists were confined to darkened hotel rooms throughout the night, and in the morning, all movement was curtailed.
That furtive report was our last picture from Kosovo. The Serb government ordered all journalists from NATO member countries to leave. Nearly 100 of us were taken under police escort in a convoy to neighboring Macedonia. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Skopje.
Macedonia is hardly a safe haven in the Balkan conflict. Just across the border from Kosovo, it is home to Serbs and Albanian refugees, along with some 10,000 NATO troops. Today, Serb demonstrators attacked the U.S. embassy.
Are hitting their targets, but there are no silver bullets in what the commander of the operation says is just the beginning of a methodical campaign against the Serb military.
We're going to systematically and progressively attack, disrupt, degrade, devastate, and we're going to destroy these forces.
Officials said they were satisfied with the first night's results, although the British Chief of Staff admitted not every mission was successful.
Bombs from our first aircraft lost lock once they were in flight and fell short of a target on open ground.
Most of the targets have been air defense sites, but General Clark says nothing is off limits.
President Milosevic and his military leaders should understand that there is no sanctuary for them.
The bombing will continue until the Serbs call off their offensive in Kosovo. So far, there is no sign of that.
There is no indication that there is any change at all in Milosevic's position.
In fact, the CIA has begun receiving unconfirmed reports that the Serbs are rounding up prominent civilians in Kosovo.
So far tonight, all NATO planes have returned safely, and just like last night, the Serbs did not try to shoot any of them down with surface-to-air missiles. The fact that the Serbs are holding on to their best weapon would seem to indicate they have no intention of giving up anytime soon. Dan?
David Martin at the Pentagon. President Clinton has been active in helping decide what targets to hit in this second round of airstrikes. For details on that, we go to CBS's Scott Pelley at the White House. Scott?
Dan, today the president personally reviewed the targets, told his generals, quote, "That looks good," and 3 hours later the bombs were falling again. Still, his national security advisor says that so far the Serbs have only intensified their war on Kosovo.
There have been some further burning of villages, further sweep operations, some shelling into Albania, and it's obviously very disturbing to us.
Would you say that Milosevic's assault on Kosovo has accelerated because of the NATO airstrikes?
I think it has increased somewhat over the past day.
Tonight, a senior official says it may take days of bombing to stop the Serbian sweep of Kosovo. After the president's address last night, polls show public support for the bombing is thin. The challenge of educating and selling the public was evident on Mr. Clinton's face after he was off the air. Mr. Clinton made the
baptism under fire for the U.S. Batwing B-2 bomber. This two-man, $2 billion aircraft flew nonstop and round-trip from Missouri to drop their bombs. CBS's Jim Axelrod got a taste of what it was like with an unprecedented look inside the B-2's ultra-realistic cockpit simulator.
This is history. This morning's homecoming of the first B-2 stealth bombers ever to see combat.
The airplane performed magnificently. By all indications that we can get, the bombs went exactly where they wanted.
Hey, go ahead and pull back on the stick now. Before those pilots ever dropped bombs over Yugoslavia, they spent hundreds of hours here, the cramped, dark cockpit of the B-2 simulator in central Missouri.
The graphics are good, the details very, very good. The button pushes, the avionics, the radar, the weapons, the systems. Every button in here does exactly what the airplane does.
In this trainer, they can simulate night, rain, high altitude. They can simulate taking off in formation, being chased by an enemy fighter. They can even simulate the turbulence felt in the cockpit when the bombs they're dropping detonate on the ground.
The realism is fantastic for us.
The B-2 pilots just back were airborne for more than 30 hours, taking off from Whiteman Air Force Base, dropping their bomb and returning, eating and sleeping through their mission, having done it many times before in practice.
You don't fly a B-2 on a long-duration sortie until you've proven that you can do it in the simulator, including your sleep cycles. Because you can't just get in a plane and when you both get tired, decide who's going to get a nap.
Tonight, the Air Force is busting its buttons over the debut of the B-2. And what they're saying is battle-tested confirmation that practice makes perfect. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri.